Imagine you've been listening to some Bible teachers and you've studied Scripture yourself, and you've become convinced that the Mosaic Covenant, the covenant God made at Mount Sinai, where He gave the law through Moses, you've become convinced that Christians today are under that covenant and its law. And then imagine one day you're reading through the book of Hebrews and you come across this verse. In speaking of a new covenant, He makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. What do you do with that? I've had several conversations recently with some of my viewers and readers who are grappling with what Hebrews 8:13 teaches. They're convinced that we're still under the Mosaic Covenant and trying to figure out what to do with this verse that, at least on the surface, seems to be claiming that the Mosaic Covenant has ended. So today we're going to look at three of the most common arguments I hear from Torahists, which is just a term that refers to those that believe that Christians are required to keep Torah or the law of Moses, which is not a mainstream Christian position. So let's take a look at their top three arguments against interpreting Hebrews 8 as teaching that the Mosaic Covenant has ended. We'll start with what I would consider the most radical approach. Now, not all Torahists would suggest this, but some do go so far as to question the validity of the book of Hebrews. One of my readers put it this way: there are major issues with the book of Hebrews that the church conveniently dismisses. It has no known author. So the church uses this pinnacle book to prove that Yahweh's Torah is done away with. Do you realize how dangerous this is? So two quick points on this. First, we also don't know who wrote the Torah. So are we prepared to challenge the legitimacy of the Torah on the same basis? Legend holds that the Torah was written by Moses, of course, but the Torah itself doesn't claim an author, which is just one of the reasons that its authorship has been hotly debated over the centuries by both Christian and Jewish thinkers. For one thing, the final chapter, Deuteronomy 34, records the death of Moses. So unless Moses wrote about his own death ahead of time, someone else must have written at least the final verses of the Torah. And on top of that, the significant variations in grammar and sentence structure throughout the Hebrew text, not to mention the hundreds of times that Moses is referred to in the third person, those things have led many scholars, both Jewish and Christian, to conclude that the Torah is most likely the product of multiple contributors, one of which was likely Moses. And by the way, despite the mystery around who wrote it, I fully accept the Torah as the inspired word of God, and you should too. So the bottom line with the book of Hebrews is this: we can either accept it or reject it. Those are really our only two choices. And if a Christ follower wants to remove the book of Hebrews from the Bible because it doesn't seem to align with their theology, then it's not the Bible they believe, but themselves. A more common argument, probably the one I hear most often, is based on the verb tenses in Hebrews 8:13. It says, in speaking of a new covenant, He makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So the way the text is worded indicates that the obsolescence and the growing old and the vanishing away are all being spoken of as a future event at the time the author wrote it, rather than something that's already happened. So the Torahist would prefer to interpret this future event as referring to the new heavens and new earth. That's when the old covenant will vanish away. Now first, if we step back and look at this verse in context, the author makes no eschatological references in his teaching. He doesn't point to the end times or the last days anywhere in this passage. So the context doesn't seem to support an interpretation that the Mosaic Covenant will not vanish away until the new heavens and new earth. There's also the fact that Jesus, at the Last Supper, said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Jesus tied the new covenant to His impending sacrifice on the cross, not to the last days or the new heavens and the new earth. And the text itself doesn't support an end times change to the Mosaic Covenant. Look at the opening phrase of verse 13. It says, in speaking of a new covenant, He makes the first one obsolete. In Greek, the verb paleo means to make or declare old. So this phrase might be more literally translated, in saying new, he has made the first one old. In other words, way back in Jeremiah 31, centuries before Christ, when God first spoke of a new covenant, it was then that he made the Mosaic Covenant old, simply by referring to the new covenant as new. In other words, it was God who introduced the distinction between the old and new covenants. And it was back then that the Mosaic Covenant began becoming obsolete and growing old and getting ready to vanish away. Remember that God and the biblical authors don't operate under modern Western concepts of precise timing and meticulous scheduling. Jesus, after his resurrection, said, "I am coming soon." And that was 2,000 years ago. So God's idea of soon doesn't always match our idea of soon. And God's idea of becoming obsolete and growing old and ready to vanish away may not be what we think either. That said, the historical context in which Hebrews was written introduces a pretty interesting and I think viable possibility. So this letter was composed sometime in the 60s AD, when the Second Temple was still standing in Jerusalem. It was written to Jews who were being persecuted for their faith in Jesus, and they were tempted to return to the Mosaic priesthood and the temple services and all that. So the historical context would support an interpretation of verse 13, in which the future language about the old covenant becoming obsolete and growing old and getting ready to vanish away was pointing to two things. First, the fact that the new Christian church was growing and spreading, and a new movement had begun. Change was in the air. And second, it could have been pointing, perhaps prophetically, to the destruction of the temple, which occurred less than 10 years after this letter was written. And when the temple was destroyed, the Mosaic priesthood and sacrifices and temple services all came to a screeching halt. They vanished away and have not returned to this day. The third argument I hear is more nuanced and sophisticated. It's based on the original Greek behind Hebrews 8:13. The claim is that the actual word covenant is not used in the original Greek in this verse. Instead, the Greek text literally says something like, "In saying new, he has made the first old." So the object of the sentence isn't specifically named in the Greek. So far, so good. Okay, I agree with the assessment up to this point. But then the question becomes, what is the author referring to here? What is the intended object of his sentence? The new what? The first what? Well, those who take the position that the Mosaic Covenant could not and has not ended will sometimes suggest that in this verse, the author's talking about priests, not covenants. So they interpret the verse as saying, in speaking of a new priesthood, he makes the first one obsolete. Now, they're correct in pointing out that the word covenant was added by English translators. It's not in the original Greek. But neither is the word priesthood. So why do the overwhelming majority of English translations interpret this verse as referring to the new covenant or new agreement, while Torahists interpret it as referring to a new priesthood? To answer that question, let's look at the context of the verse. So let's zoom out and trace the topical content of this letter. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to use a word search to help identify the flow of the discussion here. But I would strongly urge you to read through Hebrews chapter 7 and 8 and even 9 for yourself to really understand what the author's teaching here. So, we're looking at this in the ESV, and the headlines you see aren't in the original text. But they do a pretty good job of alerting us to the general topic or idea being discussed in each section. So, let's back up one chapter and start our contextual flyover at chapter 7, verse 1. And if we highlight all the uses of priest here, we can see that it's clearly a main topic of discussion. Verses 1 through 10 are discussing the priestly order of Melchizedek, and then starting at verse 11, the author moves on to compare Jesus and his priesthood to that of Melchizedek. And we can see that he's continually referring to and talking about priests in this passage. So let's flip over to chapter 8. And remember, the author didn't include chapter numbers. Those were added later. So his ideas and discussion might not neatly align with chapter numbers that we see. So here in chapter 8, when we highlight the word priest again, we see that his discussion of priests continues right on into the beginning of chapter 8. But then after verse 4, he doesn't mention priests again. And we can get a clue from the headline of this passage here, which says that Jesus is a high priest of a better covenant. And this is how the ESV translators summarized what this passage is talking about. So let's highlight the word covenant. And we can see here in the ESV that the word covenant is used 7 times in the text, starting at verse 6. And we can tell from the highlights at this abstract level that the object or focus of the author's discussion has shifted from priests now to covenants. And verse 6 is where the author makes that pivot. It reads, "Christ has obtained a ministry," meaning a priestly ministry, "that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises." So the author's saying that the priesthood that Christ has obtained is superior to the old priesthood, just as the covenant that Christ mediates is better than the old covenant. In other words, the new priesthood and covenant under Christ are superior to the old priesthood and covenant under Moses. But we still haven't dealt with the word covenant. Now, if that word is not in the original Greek in verse 13, as we just talked about, where else could the English translators have added that word in this passage? So to answer that, let me pull up the Young's literal translation on the right here. This is a very helpful translation that tries to be as literal as possible when translating Hebrew and Greek into English. Now the downside is that it doesn't always read very well. Sometimes it ends up sounding like broken English. But it can provide some valuable insight in our studies, especially for those of us who don't read Greek fluently. So Young's translation is on the right, and the first thing we notice is that it only uses the word covenant 5 times rather than the 7 times we see in the ESV, which tells us that the word covenant is only found 5 times in the original Greek. The ESV translators have added that word in 2 places. So let's first look at how Young translates verse 6. "And now he hath obtained a more excellent service. How much also of a better covenant is he mediator, which on better promises hath been sanctioned." Okay, so the Young's translation is a bit choppy, but it actually agrees with the ESV on this verse. Christ's priesthood and covenant are superior or more excellent or better than the old priesthood and covenant. And then in verse 7 is where we first see the ESV adding the word covenant in the English translation. So let's read verses 6 and 7 together in the Young's literal translation, and then try to put on our translator hat. Those verses say, "And now he hath obtained a more excellent service. How much also of a better covenant is he mediator, which, on better promises, hath been sanctioned. For if that first were faultless, a place would not have been sought for a second." So in the context of what the author of Hebrews is explaining, if you were a Bible translator, what do you think he's talking about in verse 7? If the first what had been faultless, a place would not have been sought for a second what? In the Greek, the object of the sentence isn't stated, so let's keep reading, picking up at verse 8. "For finding fault, he saith to them, Lo, days come, saith the Lord, and I will complete with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah a new covenant." Okay, here's where the author of Hebrews begins quoting from Jeremiah 31. In fact, verses 8 through 12 of this chapter of Hebrews are quoting Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. That's the passage where God first told us that he was going to make a new covenant with Israel because they broke the Mosaic Covenant. And he said the new covenant would not be like the old covenant. So the author of Hebrews is picking up the comparison between covenants that God revealed back in the book of Jeremiah. And if we view this whole passage in Hebrews in light of the Jeremiah text that the author's quoting, which, by the way, does not say anything about priests, the most reasonable inference is when he refers to the first and the second. In verse 7, he's talking about a first and second covenant, which is how the ESV and nearly every other English translation renders it. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. And the same conclusion holds true for verse 13. So in verses 8 through 12, as we looked at, the author is quoting the text from Jeremiah about the new covenant. And in the very next verse in Hebrews, where the author summarizes the point he's been building up to, the most reasonable interpretation is that when he refers to the new and the first, he's talking about the new covenant and the first covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, which again is exactly how the ESV and nearly every other English translation render this verse. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. When we take a step back and look at the entire book of Hebrews as a whole, we find that the author's teaching about a more excellent high priest, a superior sacrifice, a better temple, and a superior covenant, right? All those things. And the specific passage we looked at in Hebrews 8 is talking about covenants. He's telling us that under Jesus in the new covenant, the Mosaic Covenant has grown old, become obsolete, and vanished away. Now listen, that does not mean that the Torah is obsolete, or that the law of God has ended, or that Christians have no more need of the Old Testament. Okay, none of those things are true. It just means what it says. The Mosaic Covenant has ended, which means that Christians today are not part of that covenant. Thanks for watching. Shalom.